I am Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to episode 10 of the JFK assassination 60 years later. In the last episode, we examined the autopsy fraud that was involved in the two brain examinations in the Kennedy autopsy. You'll recall that the military pathologist had been claiming for some 30 years, including under oath, that there had been only one brain examination. But Jeremy Gunn, the general counsel for the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB, and Douglas Horne, chief analyst for military records, discovered that this was a lie. They discovered that these military officers had committed perjury, that in fact there were two brain examinations, and most important, the second brain examination necessarily had to have involved a brain that did not belong to President Kennedy. Clear evidence of fraud. Now, before we leave this particular aspect of the fraudulent autopsy for President Kennedy, I want to make two important points. One is with respect to Congress. After this came to light, Congress made absolutely no effort to get to the bottom of it, to discover what was going on here. Now, keep in mind that when Congress enacted the JFK Records Collection Act, which was responsible for this discovery, somebody had slipped a provision into the law that prohibited the ARRB from investigating any matter relating to the assassination. And it was strictly enforced by the Board of Trustees on the ARRB. So imagine the position that Jeremy Gunn and Douglas Horne were now in. They study the evidence, they study the testimony, and they realize that these military pathologists have committed perjury, these military officers, and there's nothing they can do about it. They're stuck. All they can do is just report that this is what their finding is, but they can't follow up, with a subpoena, bringing everybody back and getting to the bottom of it with sworn depositions. Can't do it. So whoever slipped that provision into the JFK Records Act, whether it was intentional or just innocent and inadvertent, clearly benefited the military intelligence establishment. And we can see that benefit here with respect to this particular part of the fraud. So the thing to keep in mind, though, is that Congress was not prohibited from investigating this matter. Now, was Congress aware of this fraud? It's a virtual certainty that they had to be. Remember, there were two detailed articles written about this aspect of the fraudulent autopsy, and they were both published in the Washington Post. Every member of Congress has to be reading the Washington Post. One was by a Washington Post columnist, and the other was an Associated Press article that was published in the Post. And the Associated Press article obviously went out all over the wire services to newspapers across the land. So all that Congress had to do was say, okay, yeah, we prohibited the ARRB from doing this, so now we need to take responsibility. They've uncovered clear evidence of fraud here and perjury. We need to start issuing subpoenas. Nothing at all. It really goes to show you the nature of America as a military nation by this time. Now, America was already a military nation back in 1963, and we see that with the fact that the military took control over the autopsy of President Kennedy, and everybody just assumed it was normal. It's just, oh yeah, well, why not the military? We're a military nation, just like the Soviet Union and so forth. Of course, the military has to do the autopsy and swear everybody to secrecy and make it all classified and so forth. It's all just considered normal. But imagine after 33 years, the control is significantly more, which is why Congress doesn't even issue a peep with respect to this particular aspect of the fraud. The second point relates to the mainstream press. I mean, this is a investigative reporter's dream come true. I mean, here is clear evidence of fraud and perjury. You would think some investigative reporter from any newspaper across the country would say, man, I can make my career here. and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And he contacts, Commander Humes and Commander Boswell and Fink and John Stringer, the photographer. He gets to the bottom of this. Is what investigative reporters do. They get to the bottom of things. They keep pulling and pushing and investigating until they finally discover the truth. Nothing. Nobody follows up with this. I mean, it was almost this attitude of, okay, these two articles have hit the mainstream press, but just let them die. Let them die. The fire will go out on its own. Don't put any fuel on it. So by this time, the mainstream press understood that whenever the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA, the three parts of this monstrosity known as a national security state, when they didn't want something addressed, everybody would know that. A formal order didn't have to go out to the mainstream press. It was just sort of, people came to understand the cues that if they don't want something discussed, just drop it. Don't even go in that direction. And so that's why the whole thing got dropped after these two articles, is because I think the control that the military intelligence establishment had over the government, and really the mainstream press by that time. Remember that I mentioned a book named National Security and Double Government by Michael Glennon. Glennon is professor of law at Tufts University. He served as general counsel or counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And he's written this very, very insightful book that I recommend called National Security and Double Government. And his thesis is that it is the national security branch of the government, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, which is really just one great big branch that divided into different sections, that they're the ones in control of the government, especially with respect to foreign affairs. For example, what's going on in Ukraine today. That's the Pentagon, the CIA. And that they permit the other three branches to have the veneer of power so that everybody still thinks that it's three branches of government and they counterbalance each other. The stuff we learn in our high school civics classes. Very quaint, very innocent. But in fact, his thesis is it's the military intelligence establishment that's in charge. And we see this back in the 1990s with respect to what's going on with respect to this fraudulent autopsy. And of course, we see it back in '63 when they're taking control of the autopsy and nobody objects. So now let's move to Robert Knudsen. And I think you're going to be interested to learn about the mystery of Robert Knudsen. So who was Robert Knudsen? Well, he was one of the White House photographers. He actually worked for the Navy, which is kind of interesting too. That he joins the Navy, and he ends up first in his class at Navy photography school, and he gets assigned to the Secretary of the Navy, who assigns him to the White House. So he's a military photographer that's assigned to take social photographs and other activity of the president, which is kind of revealing based on what I just said. In other words, he wasn't a civilian; he was military. But the guy has a renowned pedigree here, credentials. And nobody has ever questioned the professionalism of Robert Knudsen or the integrity or veracity of this man. Let me give you a little bit of background on him so you get a measure of the man. He joined the Navy in 1945. Like I say, he graduated first in his class at Navy Photographic School. And he went to work there at the White House in President Truman's era. He actually photographed President Truman's election in '48 and then the election of President Eisenhower in '52. His pictures include Eisenhower's meeting with Nikita Khrushchev in 1959, the first steps of John F. Kennedy Jr., and he photographed the weddings of Lyndon and Lucy Johnson, Lyndon Johnson's daughters, and then he was still there under the Nixon administration. He photographed Tricia Nixon, Nixon's daughter's White House wedding. He accompanied President Nixon on his trips to China and the Soviet Union in 1972, and he photographed Nixon's farewell in 1974. He retired from the Navy in 1965. This was 2 years after the Kennedy assassination, but he remained at the White House as a member of the official staff until 1974. His pictures, his photographs appeared in magazines such as Life, Saturday Evening Post, Ladies' Home Journal, and National Geographic. His scenes of Washington, D.C. became the 1969 beautification stamps issued by the U.S. Postal Service. So this guy clearly knew what he was doing, and he served in all of these administrations because obviously people were very happy with his work. And like I say, no one ever questioned the professionalism, integrity, and veracity of Robert Knudsen. So on the weekend of the assassination, he was summoned to Andrews Air Force Base and told to report there. Now, this comes from his wife and his two kids, who gave interviews before the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. Knudsen had died in 1989, and so obviously he wasn't available to give his side of the story and to the ARRB. So his wife and kids related what happened, and they were the ones that said he got this telephone call to report. And so he reported, and he was gone for 3 days, they said. And when he returned home, he said, "I cannot tell you what I saw and what I did because it's classified, but I can tell you that it was the hardest thing I've ever done." He said, he suggested that it was just really an emotional ordeal for the man. So in 1977, Knudsen gives an interview before a national photographic magazine. It was called Popular Photography. And in this interview, he says that he was the photographer for the autopsy, for the Kennedy autopsy. And again, he says, "I can't tell you what I saw because it's classified, but I can tell you that I was there, I was the photographer, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life." When he died in 1989, the Washington Post and the New York Times both carried obituaries, detailed obituaries. And as part of these obituaries, they pointed out that he had been the official photographer for the Kennedy autopsy. Well, there's just one great big problem. He wasn't. Knudsen was not the official photographer for the autopsy. That was John Stringer. Remember, we've talked about Stringer in previous episodes. Stringer was the guy that taught medical photography at Bethesda National Naval Medical School. Stringer was a real professional, just like Knudsen. But Knudsen was more of a social photographer over there at the White House. Stringer, that was his job, medical photography, autopsies. And so there is no question but that Stringer was the official photographer for the autopsy. There is also no question but that, and remember, the autopsy takes place on Friday evening, the same day of the assassination. There's also no question but that Knudsen was not there. Okay, everybody agrees on that. Now, did Knudsen just make this up? Did he just lie? That's virtually impossible. The guy, if he had made this story up, he would have known for sure that he would have been terminated at the White House. There's just no way that you're going to be able to keep a guy on your staff there that's making stuff up and lying about it. And it would have been uncovered, because remember, he gave that interview to that magazine that said, "I was the photographer for the autopsy." Nobody's that stupid, but if he really wasn't the photographer for the autopsy, it would have been uncovered. People would have said, "What's going on with Knudsen?" Some reporter would have written about it and said he wasn't the photographer of the autopsy. It was Stringer. He's making up this whole story. What's fascinating is that nobody challenged him on it. It was just like, Knudsen's talking. Now, clearly Knudsen didn't understand that when they told him that it's classified, he's sitting there thinking, well, it's what's classified is they've told me I can't report on what I've done and what I've seen. It didn't occur to him that it was also classified that he had participated in this thing. That's where he screwed up in an innocent way, but there must have been people freaking out, because certainly nobody stands up that says, Knudsen, you're full of it. You never photographed any autopsy. Everybody keeps his mouth shut. They must have been freaking out, but everybody keeps his mouth shut. The fact is that Knudsen clearly photographed something that he was convinced and made to be convinced was the Kennedy autopsy. But clearly it wasn't, because he wasn't at the autopsy. Now, what did he photograph? Well, we don't know. To this day, 60 years later, the military still will not tell us what Knudsen's role in this was. They didn't tell the Warren Commission in 1964. They didn't tell the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They didn't tell the Assassination Records Review Board. They have kept steadfastly secretive about Knudsen's role here. And there's got to be records. I mean, the military's going to keep records of what Knudsen did, but they've kept it secret. So don't ever let anybody tell you that the military can't keep secrets. Now, I'm sure some of you are aware that the military and the CIA, and they're still trying to keep a lot of their records secret, thousands of their records secret, that date back 60 years. They're saying that this involves national security. If we release these records, like the United States is going to fall into the ocean or taken over by the communists and so forth. And these are the records that were supposed to be released in the 1990s because of the JFK Records Collection Act. And instead, the CIA and the military and others said, well, we need another 25 years of secrecy. And so when those 25 years came up, they said, "Oh, wait, national security is still at stake." And meanwhile, they're hewing to the same official narrative that this was a lone nut assassination. And just some lone nut happened to be at the right place at the right time, a communist former Marine. And so they're saying, that's just a standalone deal over there, lone nut theory. But we've got to keep all our records over here related to the assassination secret because of national security. It's never made any sense. But 60 years later, they're still keeping them secret. Now, do some of those secret records relate to what Robert Knudsen was doing? It's very possible. But I mean, what possible national security concerns could be what Robert Knudsen was photographing on the evening of the assassination? Now, it's possible that he photographed President Kennedy's body in the hour and a half. Remember, they sneaked the body in. We've already examined that at 6:35 p.m. Their official narrative has always been that the body came in the Dallas casket, the heavy ornate casket, at 8 p.m. But as we've established with Marine Sergeant Boyjan and the other Navy enlisted men, the body was actually brought in 2 times, earlier at 6:35 p.m. and then later at 8 p.m. But the 6:35 p.m. was the secretive thing. That's where they were sneaking the body in that shipping casket. And so, remember, that's where they met the black hearse there that was had men with suits in it and had the shipping casket in there. So it's possible that what he photographed was during that hour and a half there, and he was made to believe this is an autopsy. Not sure. We just do not know. What we do know is that this man, whose integrity and veracity has never been questioned by anyone, or his professionalism, said, "I was the photographer for the autopsy." It could have also been done after the autopsy was completed and before the embalming. They may have brought the guy in and said, "Well, here's the autopsy, and do these photographs." We just don't know. It's impossible to know because the military has maintained strict secrecy in this thing. What we do know is that they had to have been up to no good. I mean, you don't engage in this kind of secrecy without being up to no good. Now, interestingly enough, Knudsen gave an oral deposition before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s. And the questioning by the counsel, the lawyer there, was fascinating because Knudsen is never asked during this entire testimony, what were you doing on Friday? All he was asked is, what did you do on Saturday? And after Saturday, and during those days, he was involved in the development of autopsy photographs. But never does he delve into what he was doing Friday. Now, with respect to that testimony, he says that some of the photographs, the autopsy photographs that he was developing, had probes, like iron or steel metal probes, that were put into the wounds of President Kennedy, and that those probes appear in the photographs. Well, if you look at all the autopsy photographs in the official record, there are none with probes. Now, another fascinating aspect of this is that after that testimony, Knudsen returns to his wife and family, and he tells his wife that after examining the photographs there in the official record, that he says he has no doubt that they are fraudulent photographs. He tells his wife, he says, I can't give the details, it's still classified, but there's some shenanigans going on here with these photographs. And he told his wife, I want you to know this, even though I can't go into detail with you because it's classified. I want you to know this, because if this thing ever blows up, which is very possible, I don't want, and I'm not around, I don't want you to think that I was involved in this, because I wasn't. So here's a man of tremendous integrity, professionalism, honesty, who is trying to protect his own reputation from what he clearly recognizes as fraud with respect to his family. He's trying to protect himself with his family. So here's another aspect of what's going on here. It's one of these mysteries that almost certainly relate to the autopsy fraud, the fraudulent photographs. Remember the back of the head photograph. That was when we discussed Sandra Spencer, who saw the photograph that she developed had a massive excised hole in the back of Kennedy's head, and that matched up with all the testimony of the doctors and nurses and other people, Secret Service agents, FBI agents there in Dallas, as well as at Bethesda. And the official photograph is, the back of the head is intact. So there's clear fraud taking place here. And we saw that with that testimony, and now we see it again with Knudsen's testimony, where he says there were probes that were in the wounds in the photographs that he saw and was developing. Somebody saw fit to remove those photographs from the official record. So you can get a sense here now of this autopsy fraud that's taking place. Now, why is all this important? Well, it's because, as I've emphasized for so many years, especially in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, which was followed up with The Kennedy Autopsy 2, and as well as my newest book, which I consider my best piece of work since I started working with FFF, or since I founded FFF some 34 years ago. That book's called An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story, which we'll get into later in the series. But as I've been emphasizing, there is no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. See, once I realized from a legal standpoint that this was a fraudulent autopsy, and the two brain exams are a clear example of this. Now, Knudsen, he's still in the realm of speculation. We can't really say for certain that his participation was part of the fraud, because we don't know what his participation was. It's very suspicious. The two brain examinations, there's no question that there's fraud here. And that means that there's no innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. Try to come up with one. No one has ever done it. I mean, I've been challenging people and issuing this challenge for many, many years. Give me an innocent explanation for a fraudulent autopsy. No one's been able to do it because it's impossible. And remember, the fraudulent autopsy is launched at Parkland Hospital. It doesn't just happen over here at Bethesda. It's launched at Parkland when that team of Secret Service agents operating on orders that had to have come from Lyndon Johnson, takes that body with force and prevents the medical examiner in Dallas from conducting an autopsy there. A civilian conducted autopsy. And Dr. Earl Rose, the medical examiner, was one of the most competent medical pathologists in the country. But they were bound and determined to remove this body out of that hospital. And they brandished guns and they're screaming and yelling profanities. That was the first stage of this fraudulent autopsy. And so it has to necessarily be part of the assassination. This is why I keep telling people that you don't have to master what happened in the assassination. You don't need to read any books on that. It's not necessary what the bullet trajectories are, what the magic bullet did, and so forth, who the assassins were. All you have to do is look at the autopsy. And this is what dawned on me. Remember, I told you that as I was getting into this whole subject, I always felt like I was convinced after a certain point, but not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. It was when I read Douglas Horne's 5-volume book that I became convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that anybody that gets through Horne's book will be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's because Horne lays it all out with respect to the fraudulent autopsy. The fraudulent autopsy has to be built into the assassination itself, because it's clearly part of the cover-up. And who would they be covering up for? If the plan for the fraudulent autopsy is launched right there on the moment of Kennedy's death, which it was, then it has to be bound up in covering up the assassination. Well, the only entity they could be covering up for would be themselves, because how else would they know who had conducted this assassination? Let's assume that they had not orchestrated this assassination. How could they say right there at the moment Kennedy's declared dead, hey, let's have a cover-up? I mean, that doesn't stand to reason. When the cover-up is launched at the very moment of the president's death, that's when you know that cover-up is inextricably bound up with the assassination itself. And so that's what I've been arguing for many, many years. That once you conclude that there's fraud in this autopsy, you have automatically concluded that this was a regime change operation on the part of the national security establishment. And that's why this fraud and these mysteries like Knutson are so critically important to understanding the assassination. Because again, once you conclude that there's fraud here, you have automatically concluded without any doubt that this was a national security state regime change operation. All right, that concludes our presentation on the mystery of Robert Knudsen. Maybe one of these days we'll still learn. Maybe the military will come forward and say, hey, we're going to finally reveal to you what Knudsen photographed on that weekend. Or maybe these secret records that the CIA is still holding, or maybe some military records in there are still holding. Maybe if those are ever released, they will reveal what Knudsen's role in this. We'll just have to wait and see. In any event, that's my presentation for Episode 10, the JFK assassination 60 years later. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation.